The gun was already in the room before she knocked. 3 men, 1 table, 1 man bleeding through a shirt that cost more than most people's rent in this city, and a silence so thick it had weight, the kind of silence that exists in rooms where the wrong word ends everything. The knock came anyway. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The man on the table turned his head toward the door with the measured calm of someone who has already decided that if this is how it ends, he will meet it with his eyes open and his face still. Min opened the door, and the woman who walked in was not death. She was something none of them had any defense against at all. She looked at the room. She looked at the guns. She looked at Jay, bleeding and watching her from the table with eyes already running the calculation of whether she was a problem or a solution. She set her bag down on the floor, straightened up, and said something no one in that building had said to Jay in 3 years. "Move! I need the light." Nobody moved. Jay looked at Min. Something passed between them that did not require words. Min stepped aside, and that was how it began. Not with trust, not with warmth. With a woman who walked into the most dangerous room in Seoul and told the most powerful man in it to get out of her light. He had sworn 3 years ago, in the kind of silence that lives after something is destroyed, that he would never again give any human being the power to touch him. She had been inside his safe house for 40 minutes, and the vow already had a fracture in it. Neither of them knew yet what that fracture was going to cost. To understand why that knock mattered, you have to understand what was there before it. 3 years before Nala walked through that door, Jay was a different kind of dangerous. He was still the man who controlled half of Seoul's underground financial architecture. He was still the man whose name moved through boardrooms and backrooms with equal weight. But 3 years ago, he had something that made all of that feel like a means to an end rather than the end itself. He had Yuna. She was not in the life. That was the point of her. She was warmth in a world he had built from cold materials. She asked him questions that nobody else thought to ask and listened to his answers like they mattered. In a life constructed entirely of people who needed something from him, she was the one person who seemed to just want him. Not the power, not the access. Him. He never told her that. He thought he had time. The night Yuna died, Jay was 20 minutes away. He received 1 call. He drove back at a speed that bent traffic laws and time in equal measure. He arrived to find his penthouse sealed and her gone, and a reading of the scene that the police called a robbery and that Jay knew with the cold certainty of a man who has spent his entire adult life reading rooms was something else entirely. The investigation went nowhere. Every thread he pulled either frayed or disappeared. 11 men questioned. 3 alliances burned. 2 years of controlled fury that produced nothing but the slow, terrible realization that whoever had done this was close enough to him to make themselves invisible. So he stopped looking, and he stopped feeling, and he built a wall around what was left of himself with the precision of an architect who has decided the only structure worth protecting is the one that cannot be touched. The safe house on the eastern edge of the city became his base of operations. No personal connections, no unnecessary exposure, a small loyal circle of men who understood that their relationship with Jay was professional and that any attempt to make it more would be treated as a threat. Min was the closest thing he had to a confidant, and even Min knew better than to push past certain doors. That was the life. Controlled. Contained. Sustainable in the way that a machine is sustainable, efficiently, without soul. And then, on a Thursday night in November, during a transfer operation that had been executed without incident 11 times before, someone fired a bullet into that machine. Jay was moving between vehicles when it happened. The shot came from an elevated position to his left. Min pushed him down and took the graze that would have been a clean entry. Jay went down anyway, a fragment catching him in the shoulder blade at an angle that told him, even in the adrenaline of the moment, that it had not cleared clean. They could not go to a hospital. The reasons for this were numerous and did not need discussion among men who understood the life. A hospital meant records. Records meant exposure. Exposure with an operation of this size and this sensitivity meant the end of everything. Min made one call, a private medical contact, someone who had been used before for exactly this kind of situation and who understood that discretion was not optional. It was the price of the arrangement. What neither Min nor the contact nor anyone in that building anticipated was who would answer the call that night. Nala had been in Seoul for 7 months on her international medical placement. She was good at her work, exceptionally good, in the quiet way of someone who chose medicine not for recognition, but because she genuinely could not walk past someone in pain without stopping. Her colleague Dan had handed her the call that evening with the particular apology of someone passing along something they knew was irregular. Private client, gunshot wound, non-negotiable discretion, high compensation. Dan framed it as an opportunity. Nala had looked at him for a long moment with the specific expression of a woman who knows she is being given a choice that is not really a choice, picked up her bag and gone. She had been to unusual call sites before. She had treated patients in circumstances that did not appear in her training materials. She was adaptable and she was skilled, and she had a category in her mind labeled "situations I will process later," that she had learned to fill and close and not open until she was home and safe. She sat in the back of the car on the way to the address she had been given and ran through what she knew. Gunshot wound, single patient, industrial district. She had treated worse. She would treat this one. She would be professional, and she would be thorough, and she would leave when it was done. She had absolutely no idea where she was going. The car stopped in front of a building with no name, no number, and 2 men standing outside a steel door in a way that communicated very clearly that the door was not for walking through without permission. Nala got out of the car. She looked at the building. She looked at the men. She picked up her bag, walked toward the door with the posture of a woman who has decided the situation is manageable, and knocked. Before we go any further, I have to ask, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. Because this story is about 2 people from completely different worlds finding themselves in the same room, and I want to know where in the world you are while it happens. The door opened. Min stood in it, larger than she had expected, with the flat eyes of a man running a threat assessment on her before she had taken her second breath. She looked back at him with the quiet steadiness of someone who has decided not to find him impressive. I was called, Nala told him, for a patient. Are you going to let me do my job, or are we going to stand here until he bleeds out? Min stepped aside, and Nala walked into the room that would change everything she thought she knew about what her life was going to look like. Jay was on the table. He was watching the door. And the moment he saw her, something happened behind his eyes that he had not experienced in 3 years, the involuntary, unwanted, completely human act of noticing someone, really noticing. He looked at her the way you look at something that has appeared in a place where it has no business being and yet somehow looks exactly right. She did not notice him noticing, or if she did, she filed it in the category labeled "Process Later" and moved toward the table with her bag already open. "Move," she told the man standing nearest the light. "I need to see what I'm working with." Jay watched her hands. He watched the economy of her movement, the way she assessed the wound without theater, the way she spoke only when she needed information and asked only questions she required answers to. He watched her work with the specific attention of a man who had spent years reading people for their weaknesses and had just encountered someone who did not appear to have the conventional ones. 45 minutes later, when she snapped her gloves off and reached for her bag, and Jay's voice came across the room low, and even with 4 words she was not expecting, the room held its breath. "You are not leaving." Nala turned around slowly, not because she was afraid, because she had learned, in 7 months of working in a city where she did not speak the first language and did not always understand the rules, that the way you turn around in a room tells the room everything it needs to know about whether you can be handled. She turned around like a woman who had already decided the answer was no. Jay was still on the table. He had not moved. The bullet was out and the wound was dressed, and he was sitting up now with the controlled posture of a man refusing to let his body communicate what it was going through. His eyes were on her with an expression she could not read. Not threatening exactly, not warm either. Somewhere in between, in a space she did not have a name for. "You've seen this building," he told her. "You've seen the men. You know where you are." "I know I was called to do a job," Nala replied, "and I did it. I'd like to go home." "That's not how this works." She looked at him for a long moment. She was calculating, the same way she always calculated in unfamiliar situations, running the numbers quietly behind steady eyes and arriving at the only answer available. "How long?" she asked. Something moved across his face. It was not surprise exactly. It was closer to the involuntary reaction of a man who expected an argument and received a question instead, as if her directness had walked past his defenses by not bothering to knock. "Until I decide it's safe," Jay told her. Nala nodded once, the way someone nods when they have received information they intend to work with. Min showed her to a room at the end of a corridor. It was small and it was clean, and it had a lock on it, which she noted immediately, not because it made her feel safer, but because she wanted to understand whether the lock was for her protection or her containment. She suspected both. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to feel the full weight of the situation. This was something she had trained herself to do. 3 minutes. No more. You look at the thing clearly, you let it be as heavy as it is, and then you make a plan. The plan was simple. Do not panic. Do not escalate. Do not make yourself a problem. Watch. Learn. Wait for the opening that always, in her experience, appeared eventually in every situation that felt sealed. She lay down on the bed without removing her shoes and stared at the ceiling and listened to the building. She could hear voices down the corridor. She could hear the percussion of the city outside, muffled and distant and indifferent. She could hear at one point footsteps that stopped outside her door and then continued. She did not acknowledge to herself that she had held her breath until they passed. Morning came the way mornings come in rooms with no curtains, hard and without ceremony. The light that came through the barred window was gray and industrial, and it made the room look exactly like what it was. Nala got up, washed her face in the small attached bathroom, pulled her hair back into the tightest bun it would go into, and walked out of the room with the same energy she walked into every shift with. The energy of someone who has decided the day belongs to them, regardless of the circumstances it has arrived in. 2 men she had not seen before looked up when she walked into the main space. She looked back at them without hesitation, went to the small side kitchen she had clocked the night before, found coffee and a kettle, and made herself a cup. Nobody stopped her. Nobody spoke to her. She stood at the kitchen counter and drank her coffee and watched the room and began, with the methodical patience that was perhaps her most formidable quality, to understand the architecture of the place she was in. Jay was not in the room, but she could feel the shape of his absence the way you can feel a room that a large piece of furniture has recently been moved out of. Everything was slightly oriented around where he was not. She was on her second cup when she heard his voice from the corridor behind her. "You slept." It was not a question. She turned and found him standing in the kitchen doorway in a black turtleneck and dark trousers, looking considerably more composed than a man who had a bullet removed 12 hours ago had any right to look. His shoulder was held carefully, but his eyes were exactly as they had been the night before, still, watchful, running the calculation. "I did," she told him. "Your building is loud. You should look at the ventilation in the east corridor. Something is loose." He looked at her for a beat that was 1 beat longer than necessary. "I'll have someone look at it," he said finally. And he walked away. Nala watched him go. She turned back to her coffee. She set the cup down slowly. She had spent 7 months learning to read a city in a language she did not fully speak. She had gotten very good at reading what was underneath the surface of things. And what was underneath the surface of that conversation, that short, completely ordinary exchange about ventilation, was something she filed in the category labeled "process later" with slightly more care than she usually used, because what she had seen in Jay's eyes when he looked at her was not what she had expected to find there. She had expected coldness. She had expected the flat assessment of a man who viewed her as a complication to be managed. What she had seen instead, in one unguarded fraction of a second before his control reasserted itself, was something that looked very much like relief, like a man who had walked into a room expecting to be alone and found, to his own confusion, that he was not sorry about it. 4 things happened on the second day that mattered. The first was that Min brought Nala her phone and told her she could call her colleague Dan to say she had been delayed on a private case. 1 call, 2 minutes. He stood in the doorway while she made it, which she had expected. She told Dan she was fine, that the patient required monitoring, that she would be in touch when she could. Dan asked if she was sure. She said yes. She did not look at Min while she said it. The second was that one of Jay's men caught a fever by midday, and Nala, without being asked and without making anything of it, assessed him in the operations room and told Min what he needed from a pharmacy 2 blocks away. Min looked at her for a long moment and then sent someone for the medicine. By evening the man's fever had broken. He did not thank her, but he stopped looking at her like a variable and started looking at her like a person, which in that building was its own form of progress. The third was that she found the library. It was not what you would call a library. It was a shelf in a room she passed on the way back from the bathroom. 3 shelves of books that had no obvious organizing principle. Korean titles, 2 French novels, a worn English copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations that had been opened so many times the spine had given up trying to hold itself together. She stood in the doorway and looked at that shelf for a long time. The 4th thing was Jay. He found her in the doorway of that room at 4 in the afternoon. He stopped in the corridor behind her without announcing himself, which she registered in her peripheral vision immediately, but chose not to react to. She kept her eyes on the shelf. "The Aurelius is yours," she told him without turning around. A pause. "How do you know that?" "Because it's the only one that's been read," Nala replied. "Everything else on that shelf is a collection. That one is a relationship." The silence that followed was different from the silences she had experienced with him before. Those had been silences of control, of a man deciding what to allow into a space. This was a silence of something else. Something she recognized as the particular quiet of a person who has just heard themselves described more accurately than they expected by someone who has no reason to know them. Jay came and stood beside her in the doorway, not close, but beside. "You read it?" he asked. "I have my own copy," she told him, "though mine is in better condition than yours." Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. It did not arrive, but the muscles that would have made it had clearly been notified. They stood there for a moment that had no practical reason to last as long as it did. "Why medicine?" he asked eventually. Nala considered the question, not because she did not know the answer, but because she was deciding how much of the answer to give him. "My mother was a caregiver," she told him. "She spent her whole life putting herself into other people's difficult moments. She was extraordinary at it. She never once saved anything for herself." A breath. "I decided I would be extraordinary at the work and better at the other part." "The other part," he repeated. "Saving something for yourself." She looked at him then, directly, and she found him looking back at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the calculating stillness, not the cold authority. Something that lived underneath both of those things. Something that had been under there for a long time and had not had occasion to surface. "How is your shoulder?" she asked him, because the moment had gotten to a depth that required one of them to do something practical with it. "Functional," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her for a moment. "It hurts," he said. "In the morning, when I forget about it and move too fast. It was such a simple answer, such a human answer. She wondered if he noticed that it was the most honest thing he had probably said in a very long time. From the brief flicker of something behind his eyes immediately after the words were out, she thought perhaps he had. "Come to the medical room after dinner," she told him. "I want to check the dressing." He said nothing. She took that as agreement and walked away down the corridor with her coffee, and he watched her go, and the corridor was quiet, and somewhere underneath the architecture of the man he had built himself into over 3 years, something that had been entirely still began, without his permission, to move. "I need to pause for a second and ask you something. Because right now, Jay is starting to look at Nala in a way he clearly did not plan for. And Nala is doing that thing where she pretends she is not noticing. So tell me in the comments, do you think she already feels it too, or is she genuinely just being professional right now? I want to know what you think before this story goes any further." That evening, Jay came to the medical room. He sat on the edge of the examination table and let her unwrap his dressing with the particular stillness of a man who has decided to let something happen rather than control it. She worked without speaking for the first 2 minutes. The wound was clean and healing well, she told him so. "You're good," he said, not flattering her, stating a fact. "Yes," she agreed simply. His eyes moved to her face. "You're not afraid of me." Nala paused her work and considered this. "I've been in rooms with people in a lot of pain," she replied. "Pain makes people dangerous. I learned a long time ago that being afraid of that doesn't help anyone, including me." "I'm not in pain," Jay told her. She looked at him with an expression that was quiet and precise and landed somewhere he clearly felt because his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know," she said, and she went back to the dressing. And for the first time in 3 years, Jay sat in a room with another person and did not want the room to end. The 3rd day, the 4th, the 5th. Time inside the safe house had its own rhythm, different from the rhythm of the world outside. Nala learned it the way she learned every environment she entered, by watching what repeated, what changed, and what people thought they were hiding. She learned that Min arrived every morning at 6 and did not leave until midnight. She learned that the surveillance screens on the east wall showed 9 camera feeds and that 3 of them covered angles she would not have chosen, which told her something about how the building had been set up, probably quickly, by someone thinking about observation rather than security. She learned that Jay ate alone, always at a small table in the back corner of the operations room, and that none of his men ever approached him during that time, not even Min. On the 4th evening, Nala set a second plate at the table on the opposite side before he arrived. She did not wait to see his reaction. She took her own food to the kitchen counter and ate there, as she had every other evening, watching the room with the patient eyes of someone who was genuinely not trying to force anything. She heard him come in. She heard him stop. She did not look up. She heard the sound of a chair moving. Heard him sit. She kept eating. When she looked up 20 minutes later, his plate was clean and he was gone. But the chair on the other side of the table had not been pushed back to its original position. It was still angled slightly toward the place where she had sat the plate, like he had sat with the intention of her presence even in its absence. She thought about that for a long time that night. On the 5th night, she could not sleep. The soul rain had returned, heavier than the first night, and it hit the barred window of her room in a way that sounded personal. She lay in the dark and listened to it, and thought about Dan, who had called twice, about her placement supervisor, who would be expecting a report next week, about her apartment, small and warm and full of plants she had watered carefully every morning before she left for work, and that were currently in the process of discovering what happened when the person who loved them disappeared without notice. She was thinking about the plants when she heard it. Footsteps. Coming down the corridor toward her room. Slow. Not the footsteps of someone going somewhere. The footsteps of someone who has already decided where they are stopping. They stopped outside her door. She did not move. She did not speak. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence on the other side of the door with a precision she would not have admitted to. He did not knock. He did not come in. He simply stood there, and she could hear, in the particular quality of the silence, that he was not doing it for any operational reason. He was not checking a perimeter. He was not monitoring a threat. He was standing outside a door because the person behind it had become the place his feet went when the building went quiet and his own thoughts got loud. After a while, the footsteps moved away. In the morning, there was a glass of water on the floor outside her door. Just a glass of water, clean and cold and sitting on the floor like it had always been there, like someone had placed it there quietly in the dark and left before it could become anything that required a conversation. Nala looked at it for a long time. She picked it up. She drank it. She set the empty glass on the floor where she had found it. She never mentioned it. Neither did he. But there was something between them now that had not been there on the first night. It did not have a name yet. It did not need one. It was the kind of thing that grows in the dark between people who are being careful and honest at the same time, and it was growing whether either of them chose it or not. It was on the 6th day that Min crossed a line. Nala had been in the operations room looking at one of the surveillance screens, not because she had permission to, but because nobody had told her she did not, when one of the younger men at the station nearest the door made a comment in Korean that she did not fully understand, but that the room's reaction to told her everything she needed to know. Laughter. The specific laughter of men who believe a woman cannot tell the difference between being laughed at and being laughed near. She turned around slowly. Before she could speak, Min's voice came from across the room, flat, final. 2 sentences that killed the laughter immediately and left the young man looking at the floor. She looked at Min. He was already back at his work. He did not look up. She stood there for a moment and then returned to what she had been doing. But she thought about it for the rest of the day. The enforcer who showed no one warmth and gave no one comfort had stepped in without being asked and had said nothing to her about it afterward. That evening she told Jay what Min had done, not to report it, just because it seemed like something he should know about the man who worked for him. Jay listened. He said nothing for a moment. Then, Min has a sister. That was all he said. But it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the first thing he had offered her that was not operational, not a decision or an instruction, but a piece of the world he carried inside him, a small piece, handed across a table like something fragile. She received it that way. Now here is where I need you to stay with me, because what happens next is the moment I want every person watching this to feel in their chest. Jay is just starting to open. Nala is just starting to trust the space between them, and someone is about to try to take that apart before it has even had the chance to become something. If that makes your blood move, you are exactly where this story needs you to be. On the 7th day, Director Song called. Nala was not in the room, but she was close enough to the corridor to hear Jay's voice change. Not its volume, its temperature. It dropped 2 degrees on the first sentence and kept going. By the time the call ended, it was the voice of a man who has been reminded, by someone who knows exactly where to press, of everything he has chosen to bury. She heard him come down the corridor after the call ended. She heard him stop outside the room she was in. He did not come in, but she heard him breathe. One long, controlled breath. The breath of a man pressing something back down. Then he walked away, and the safe house felt colder than it had before. Director Song. The name had moved through Jay's world for years like background music, familiar, neutral, present without being prominent. Song was a political figure with extensive private interests, a man who moved between legitimate boardrooms and the kind of conversations that do not have minutes taken, and he had been what Jay would have described as a neutral party, not an ally, not an enemy, a man who existed in the space between those categories and was useful precisely because of it. Jay had never suspected him of anything. That was, it would turn out, exactly the point. The intelligence came through on the 7th evening. One of Jay's external contacts, a source embedded in a government financial monitoring unit, had been sitting on a piece of information for 3 weeks, waiting to verify it before bringing it forward. On the seventh evening, it was verified, and Min brought the report to Jay at the back table, set it down in front of him, and stepped back without a word. Jay read it once. He set it down. He read it again. The report connected 14 months of financial movement, shell accounts, and communication intercepts to a single organizing intelligence. It mapped the rival faction that had been pressuring Jay's operation not as an independent group but as a constructed front, built, funded, and directed by someone who had access to the kind of information about Jay's operation that only an insider could have. And at the center of it, clearly and without ambiguity, was Song's name. But that was not the worst of it. The report had an attachment, a secondary file that the analyst had included because of its relevance to the primary timeline. It was an intercept from 3 years ago, 2 weeks before Yuna died, showing a communication between Song's private network and a contact inside Jay's penthouse security. The communication contained one instruction, one sentence. The kind of sentence that once read cannot be unread and cannot be managed and cannot be placed in the category labeled process later because it is too large and too devastating for any category. Jay sat at that table for a long time after Min left the room. Nala found him there because she had seen Min's face when he came out of the corridor and had followed the line of whatever Min had been carrying back to its source. She stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at the man at the table and understood immediately, with the diagnostic precision of someone trained to read bodies, that whatever had just happened to him was not operational. It was not a business problem. It was the kind of damage that lives in the part of a person that is not professional at all. She did not ask if he was all right. He was clearly not. And she had learned in her years of work that asking someone who is clearly not all right whether they are all right is not kindness. It is distance disguised as concern. She pulled the chair out across from him and sat down. He looked up. Something in his expression shifted when he found her there, not softening exactly, but changing in the way that a closed fist changes when it is no longer necessary to keep it closed. "Song," he said. The word came out quiet and precise, like a diagnosis. She waited. "He was there before," Jay told her. "The whole time I was looking, he was the one who put the thing I was looking for where I would never find it." She understood he was not talking about the operation. She understood who he was talking about without him having to say her name, and she did not fill the space with words, because this was not a moment that needed words. This was a moment that needed presence. "I built everything after that on the idea that I had been careless," Jay continued, and his voice was the voice of a man watching something he believed about himself come apart. That letting someone close had been a failure of judgment, that the lesson was to not repeat it. Nala was quiet for a moment, then carefully, "And now?" He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had been carefully not looking at her for 7 days. "Now I know it was never carelessness," he told her. "It was surgery. He performed surgery on me, and I've been living inside the recovery without knowing what put me there." The room was very still. Nala looked at the man across from her, the man who had kept her in this building against her will and left water outside her door in the dark. The man who ran a criminal empire with absolute control and had just admitted to her that for 3 years he had been grieving a wound someone else had inflicted on purpose, and she felt something move through her that she had been carefully filing away for 7 days. She put her hand on the table, palm up, not reaching for him, just placing it there, available, the way you put a light on in a window. He looked at her hand for a long moment. Then he placed his hand over hers. He did not say anything. Neither did she. The room held it quietly, the way rooms sometimes hold the things that happen in them when no one is watching and everything is finally, after a very long time, true. Somewhere in the building, a surveillance alarm chirped once and went silent. Neither of them moved. Later, she would not be able to identify the exact moment. That was the thing about walls coming down. They rarely fell in one dramatic collapse. They went brick by brick, in moments so small they looked like nothing from the outside, and then one morning the structure that had seemed permanent was gone and you were standing in the open with no memory of the last piece falling. For Jay, she thought it had started with the ventilation comment. For her, she suspected it had started earlier than she admitted. After the night at the table, something in the safe house changed. Not the structure of it, not the rules, which were technically still in place. Nala was still not free to leave. Jay was still running an operation from the room down the hall. But the emotional architecture of the place shifted in a way that everyone in the building registered without discussing. Min noticed. He said nothing, but the way his eyes moved between them when they were in the same room told Nala that he was filing something away about his employer that was new information. Jay began spending time in the library room, so did she, not always together. Sometimes she would come in and find a book had been moved, or a chair was at a slightly different angle, and she would know he had been there, and that was its own form of communication. Sometimes they were in there at the same time and said almost nothing, just existed in the same quiet space with the rain against the window and the city somewhere outside, and those were the hours that she found herself thinking about later when the building went dark. On the 9th night, Jay told her about Yuna, not all of it, not the end of it. He told her about the beginning, about a woman he had known for years before he understood what she meant to him, and about how by the time he understood it, he had been too careful with the knowledge, holding it close instead of giving it, and the time he thought he had turned out to be none at all. Nala listened with the quality of attention she gave to things that mattered. She knew, Nala told him when he finished, quietly, with certainty. People who are loved the way you are describing always know, even when it hasn't been said. She knew. He looked at her. You say that with a lot of confidence for someone who just met me. I say it, Nala replied, because I have been in this building for 9 days and I know more about who you are than most people probably do after years. You are not a complicated person to understand if someone is paying attention. Something moved through his expression that she had not seen before, not the involuntary warmth he had been struggling to contain. Something more deliberate, something that had decided. He reached across and tucked a loose twist of her hair back from her face. One slow, careful movement. His hand stayed for a moment against her cheek. Nala. The way he said her name was different from every other time. It was not a summons. It was not an address. It was the way you say something when you want the word to know it is not just a word. She turned her face slightly into his hand. Just slightly. Just enough. Outside the building, a black car moved slowly down the industrial street and did not stop. Its headlights swept across the safe house wall and disappeared. The man inside it looked at the building with the calm eyes of a man who has waited 3 years and is not troubled by the prospect of waiting one more night. Director Song set his phone down on the seat beside him and told his driver to keep moving. He had everything he needed. Tomorrow would be enough. The morning of the 10th day arrived wrong. Nala felt it before she understood it. It was in the texture of the building when she woke up. The way the sounds were different, voices with a different pitch, footsteps with a different urgency, the hum of a machine that has shifted from operational to alert. She was dressed and out of her room before anyone came to tell her. Min found her in the corridor with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not fear. Min was not built for fear. It was the expression of a man who has received information that confirms the worst version of the thing he had been hoping was not true. Song is moving, Min told her, not explaining, just stating. We have movement on 3 perimeter points. It started 40 minutes ago. She absorbed this. Where is Jay? Getting ready. She found him in the armory room, which was what the room 2 doors past the library turned out to be. He was checking a weapon with the focused precision of someone who has done this enough times that it requires no thought, and he looked up when she walked in with an expression that tried to be the operational face and did not entirely succeed. I told Min to get the car ready, he said. You are leaving in 20 minutes. No, she replied. He put down what he was holding. This is not a discussion. You are right, she agreed. It is not. I am not leaving, and I am not going to stand here and argue about it. I am going to ask you what you need me to do, and then I am going to do it. Jay looked at her for a long moment. The calculation was visible. She could see him running it. The version of the situation where she was a civilian who needed to be removed from danger against the version where she was the most competent person in the building who understood wounds and crisis and staying calm in rooms where other people were not. He made a decision. The medical room, he said. Stay in it. If anyone comes through this building tonight who is not one of my men, that room has a secondary lock behind the cabinet on the left wall. She nodded once. Nala. She stopped. Stay alive, he said. And the way he said it carried everything that had been building for 10 days in 3 words that asked for nothing and meant everything. The first wave hit at 9:17 that evening. 6 men on the east approach. Min's team handled it in 11 minutes with a precision that told Nala, listening from the medical room with her hands braced against the cabinet, that whatever these men were, they were not amateurs, and neither were the men holding the building. Then it went quiet. The quiet lasted 22 minutes. The silence had a quality that Nala recognized from emergency medicine, the silence between a patient stabilizing and a patient crashing. It felt like resolution. It was not. Jay came to the medical room during the silence. He opened the door and looked at her standing in the middle of the room, her bag already open on the table behind her with everything organized and accessible, and something in his expression changed. It is over, he told her. The East team is down. Song has pulled back. She let out one breath. He stepped into the room. And for approximately 4 minutes, in the false quiet of a siege that had not yet shown its second face, the two of them stood close together in a medical room with the noise of the city nowhere near them, and the reality of everything that had happened in 10 days sitting in the air between them like something that had been waiting to be named. He put his hand on her face again. She leaned into it. He kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not careful or negotiated. It was the kiss of a man who has decided, finally, completely, and at cost, that he is done being afraid of the thing he wants. Then, Min's voice came through the comm. 2 words that landed like ice water. Second wave. Stop. I need you to tell me something right now before this goes any further. Because everything is about to come down at once, and Jay is going to have to make a choice that he cannot take back. So tell me in the comments. What do you think he chooses? Does he protect the empire he has built his entire life on, or does he choose her? Tell me before you see it. I want to know if you called it. The second wave was different. It was not 6 men. It was not tactical. It hit 4 entry points simultaneously, with a coordination that spoke of someone who had studied this building, its rhythms, its coverage gaps, and its one structural weakness that Nala had pointed out on the second morning and that had not yet been repaired. The ventilation in the east corridor. Min went down 20 minutes into the second wave, not fatally, but down. And with Min down, the line contracted, and the building that had felt impenetrable for 10 days suddenly felt very much like what it was: concrete and steel and surveillance cameras and a handful of men against a force that had been built specifically to overcome them. Jay got to Nayla's position with 2 of his men. He found her exactly where he told her to stay, the secondary lock engaged, her bag over her shoulder and her expression carrying the focused calm of someone who has decided to be useful rather than afraid. He looked at her. She looked at him. He had 2 options. Fight from position and protect the building at the cost of exposure, possibly hers. Or move, take her, get out, and give up the infrastructure he had spent years building. There was no version of this choice that did not cost him something enormous. He chose her, not impulsively, not because he had forgotten what the building meant or what letting it go would cost. He chose her with the full weight of the calculation behind him, every number run, every alternative closed, and in the end the choice was not difficult at all. That was the thing about it. He had expected the choice to be the hardest thing he had ever done. Instead, it arrived like something he had already known. He took her hand. The fight that followed was different from every fight Jay had conducted in the previous 3 years. This was not the controlled, calculated precision of a man protecting an asset. This was the ferocity of a man who has finally, after years of managing the temperature of everything, allowed himself to be fully present in what is happening. There is a specific quality to a person who has stopped fighting to preserve something they are afraid to lose and started fighting to protect something they have already chosen. That quality is terrifying. Song's men encountered it and did not know what they were dealing with. Nala stayed low and stayed mobile and used every corner of the building's layout that she had spent 10 days memorizing with a patience that now turned out to have been preparation for something she had not known was coming. When one of Jay's men took a hit in the third corridor, she was there in under 40 seconds, and she kept him alive with her hands and her bag and the specific competence of a woman who chose medicine because she genuinely could not walk past someone in pain without stopping. Song was taken in the basement level of the building by 2 of Min's men who had held their position through the second wave with the kind of loyalty that only comes from years of genuine trust. When his men realized their direction had gone silent, the assault collapsed inside 4 minutes. The building went quiet for the second time that night. This time, the quiet was different. Jay found Nala on the 3rd floor, still with the man she had been treating, still working, head down, focused. She had not stopped to process what had happened. She would not stop until there was nothing left that needed her hands. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, the way he had watched her on the first night, except that what he felt watching her now was entirely different from the calculating assessment of the first night. What he felt now had a name, several of them, and he was not afraid of any of them. She looked up when she felt him there. "He is stable," she told him. "He needs a real hospital in the next 2 hours." "I'll arrange it," he said. She nodded. She began repacking her bag with the methodical care of a person who respects their tools. He came and sat beside her on the floor, his back against the wall, and she finished packing her bag and then sat back against the wall beside him. "This is the moment the title promised you. The man who swore he would never trust anyone again is sitting on a floor in the dark with the woman he chose, and neither of them is pretending anymore. If this story did something to you, if you felt this, then you belong here. Hit subscribe, because every story I tell is built to make you feel exactly this." Neither of them spoke for a while. The building settled around them, the particular silence of a structure that has been tested and held. "You could have sent me away," Nala said eventually. "On the first day. You could have had Dan come and get me and none of this would have happened to you." Jay considered this for a moment. "I know," he replied. "So why didn't you?" He turned his head to look at her. She turned hers to look at him. They were very close. The way people are close when they have just been through something together that most people never go through at all. "Because you told me to move," he said, "and I wanted to hear what you would say next." She looked at him for a long moment. Then the smile arrived fully, and the temperature of the entire corridor changed. "That is a very honest answer," she told him. "I'm trying something new," he replied. She laughed, quietly and completely. And he watched her laugh with an expression on his face that Min, passing the end of the corridor at that moment, had never in his years of service seen on his employer's face before. He stopped, looked, and kept walking without saying anything, but the corners of his mouth moved. If you know someone who needs a story like this right now, someone who has been telling themselves that being alone is the safer choice, share this with them. Not because of the Mafia boss, because of the nurse who walked into the dark and refused to leave until the light came back on. They will understand. The city outside was beginning its early morning sounds. Somewhere distant, Seoul was waking up, indifferent and ordinary and continuous, the way cities are continuous regardless of what happens inside the buildings they surround. Inside the safe house, something that had been held in the hands of 2 people who had every reason to let it go was still there. still warm, still held. Jay would spend the next weeks dismantling what Song had built. The process would be long and careful and costly in the ways that matter in the world he operated in. Song would face consequences that existed in the spaces between the things that courts see and the things that streets remember, and the 3 years of constructed isolation that Song had engineered would be taken apart piece by piece, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the daily accumulation of a man choosing over and over not to be alone. Nala went back to her placement. She finished her contract. She did not forget the safe house. She did not try to. Jay called her 3 days after she left the building. He did not have a reason prepared. When she answered, he said, "I wanted to hear what you would say." She laughed again. He filed the sound of it in the only place he had ever filed anything that mattered, somewhere permanent, somewhere safe. He had sworn 3 years ago that he would never trust anyone again. The thing about vows made in grief is that they are made by the version of you that exists in the worst moment of your life. That version is real. That version deserves every word. But it is not the only version, and it does not get to make permanent decisions on behalf of every version that comes after. Jay learned this the hard way, the best way, the way that costs something and gives back more than you knew you were missing. A nurse knocked on his door, and the man who had sworn to stay sealed let her in. That was the whole story, and it was enough.